February 16, 1945. Corregidor Island, Manila Bay, Philippines. Lieutenant Colonel Seiichi Ota of the Imperial Japanese Army stood on the highest point of Corregidor's topside barracks area, scanning the morning sky with his binoculars. The sun was barely rising over Manila Bay, but already the distant drone of aircraft engines disrupted the dawn quiet. Through his lenses, he could make out a formation of twin-engine transport planes lumbering toward the island. Large, ungainly aircraft with distinctive high wings and tail sections. "American transports," he muttered to his aide. "They move like pregnant ducks." For months, Japanese intelligence had noted increasing numbers of these aircraft, the Douglas C-47 Skytrain, throughout the Pacific theater. But Ota and his commanders had dismissed them as merely logistical assets, vulnerable cargo haulers that posed no serious threat to their defensive positions. Certainly not to Corregidor, the Gibraltar of the East, a natural fortress with sheer cliffs rising hundreds of feet from the water. Ota lowered his binoculars and chuckled. "Let them waste fuel flying circles around us. No sane commander would attempt a landing on this island." At that moment, the doors on the sides of the approaching aircraft slid open. To Ota's astonishment, hundreds of men began jumping from the planes, their parachutes blossoming against the blue sky like deadly white flowers. "Paratroopers!" Ota shouted, his voice hoarse with disbelief. "They're jumping onto the island!" In that moment, the Japanese officers' perception of American capabilities fundamentally shifted. These were not merely transport planes, they were delivery systems for combat power, able to insert soldiers precisely where they were needed most, bypassing prepared defenses and making a mockery of geographic obstacles. What Lieutenant Colonel Ota witnessed that February morning was the culmination of years of American innovation, industrial capacity, and strategic vision. The C-47 Skytrain, an aircraft initially dismissed by both Allied and Axis powers as a lumbering, defenseless cargo hauler, had evolved into one of the war's most decisive weapons. It could deliver paratroopers behind enemy lines, supply isolated garrisons, evacuate casualties, and project combat power across vast oceanic distances. The story of how this unassuming transport plane transformed modern warfare begins not with dramatic combat, but with something far more mundane: the problem of moving people and goods efficiently through the sky. The Douglas C-47 Skytrain emerged from one of the most successful commercial aircraft designs in history. In the mid-1930s, the Douglas Aircraft Company developed the DC-3, a revolutionary passenger transport that could fly coast to coast across the United States with just 3 refueling stops. Its reliability, comfort, and economy made it the first truly profitable passenger aircraft. As war clouds gathered over Europe, the U.S. Army Air Corps recognized the DC-3's potential as a military transport. In 1940, the Army ordered a militarized version, designated the C-47. This new variant featured a strengthened floor, a large cargo door on the left side of the fuselage, a hoist attachment, and modified electrical systems. The military asked for an aircraft that could carry troops, cargo, and even vehicles, recalled Donald Douglas, founder and president of Douglas Aircraft. "We gave them essentially a flying truck, simple, reliable, and capable of operating from the crudest airfields." Simple as it appeared, the C-47 incorporated crucial features that would later prove decisive in combat. Its twin Pratt & Whitney R-1830 twin Wasp engines, each generating 1,200 horsepower, gave it sufficient power to operate fully loaded from short, unimproved runways. Its rugged landing gear could handle rough terrain. Most importantly, its cavernous fuselage could accommodate up to 28 fully equipped paratroopers, 6,000 pounds of cargo, or a combination of personnel and equipment. When America entered World War II in December 1941, only a handful of C-47s had been delivered to the Army Air Forces. The need for rapid expansion of transport capability was obvious, and Douglas Aircraft responded by dramatically scaling up production. A new factory in Oklahoma City joined the original Santa Monica plant in building C-47s around the clock. By mid-1943, the Oklahoma facility alone was producing more than 150 aircraft per month. In total, American factories would build over 10,000 C-47s during the war, a production miracle that underscored the nation's industrial might. While European commanders quickly recognized the C-47's value for troop transport and supply missions, it was in the Pacific theater that the aircraft would demonstrate its most revolutionary capabilities. There, vast distances, difficult terrain, and the island-hopping nature of the campaign created unique challenges that conventional military transportation simply could not meet. The Japanese strategy in the Pacific relied heavily on their ability to establish island garrisons that would be too costly for the Americans to assault directly. Each island fortress was meant to serve as an unsinkable aircraft carrier and supply base, creating an interlocking defensive perimeter around Japan's newly won empire. The Japanese army, practiced in rapid infantry movement and light equipment, believed they could shift forces quickly enough to counter American advances. This strategy did not account for the C-47 Skytrain. While the Mitsubishi G4M Betty and other Japanese aircraft were optimized for long-range bombing or naval attack, Japan had no equivalent to the Skytrain's versatile transport capabilities. As one captured Japanese intelligence document later revealed, Americans possess the ability to move entire infantry units by air, complete with heavy weapons and supplies, over distances we considered impassable. This capability renders our defensive perimeter porous. The first major demonstration of the C-47's game-changing potential came on September 5, 1943, at Nadzab, New Guinea. General Douglas MacArthur had been pushing his forces northward along New Guinea's coast, but Japanese resistance was fierce, and the dense jungle made ground movement excruciating. The solution came in the form of an audacious plan. Use C-47 Skytrains to drop paratroopers directly onto Nadzab's airfield, bypassing Japanese defenses entirely. The 503rd Parachute Infantry Regiment, comprising 1,700 men, would make the jump. Colonel Kenneth Kinsler, commanding the airlift portion of the operation, had assembled 86 C-47s for the mission. We were sending these aircraft, each packed with 20 jumpers and their equipment, into an area where Japanese fighters could potentially intercept them, he noted in his after-action report. The C-47s had no defensive armament. They were completely vulnerable. Turkey, Japanese commanders had indeed noted the presence of the large transport planes at Allied airfields, but dismissed them as rear-area logistics assets. Our intelligence indicated the Americans were using these aircraft primarily to move supplies between Australia and New Guinea, wrote Major General Adachi Hatazo, commander of the Japanese 18th Army. We did not consider them a direct tactical threat. This misconception would prove costly. On the morning of the jump, the C-47s, flying in tight formation at 1,000 feet, approached the drop zone. As paratroopers from the 503rd leapt into the sky over Nadzab, Japanese defenders were completely surprised. By the time they could organize a response, American paratroopers had secured the airfield. Lieutenant Richard Barker, a paratrooper who jumped that day, later recalled, "The Japanese never expected us to appear from the sky. They had fortified the approaches to Nadzab by land, with machine gun nests and artillery. But we simply bypassed all of it, coming down right on top of their positions." Within hours, C-47s were landing on the captured airstrip, bringing in reinforcements, artillery, and supplies. What would have been a weeks-long jungle slog had been accomplished in a single morning. General MacArthur, who observed the operation from a B-17 flying fortress, described it as a perfect example of air-ground teamwork. See, the success at Nadzab validated the concept of using the C-47 as a delivery system for combat power. But it was just the beginning. Throughout 1943 and 1944, American commanders in the Pacific increasingly incorporated the aircraft into their tactical and operational planning. While the C-47's role in combat drops drew the most attention, its less glamorous logistical functions proved equally decisive. In the jungles of New Guinea and across the scattered islands of the Pacific, conventional supply lines were often impossible to establish. The C-47's ability to deliver everything from ammunition to medical supplies, often to improvised airstrips hacked from the jungle, gave American forces a crucial advantage. The Japanese soldier traveled light and lived off the land, observed General Walter Kruger, commander of the Sixth Army. Our troops required substantially more supply, ammunition, rations, medical supplies. The C-47 made it possible to maintain these supply lines even to the most isolated positions. This capability proved particularly valuable during the Philippines campaign. As American forces island-hopped toward the Japanese-held archipelago, C-47s supported both conventional and unconventional operations. They delivered supplies to Filipino guerrilla forces, evacuated wounded personnel, and maintained communication lines across vast stretches of ocean. The aircraft earned various nicknames throughout the theater: Gooney Bird, Dakota in British service, and Skytrooper. Japanese forces developed their own less complimentary terms, including what translated roughly as the groaning transport, for the distinctive sound of its engines. By early 1945, as American forces prepared for the liberation of the Philippines, the C-47 had become an integral part of operational planning. General MacArthur and his staff had learned to leverage the aircraft's capabilities to overcome the defensive advantages of terrain that Japanese forces had previously exploited. One of the most ambitious applications of this approach was the planned assault on Corregidor. The island fortress, at the entrance to Manila Bay, had enormous symbolic significance. It was here that American forces had surrendered to the Japanese in May 1942, with General MacArthur vowing, "I shall return." Now, nearly 3 years later, retaking Corregidor would fulfill that promise. But Corregidor presented enormous tactical challenges. Its steep cliffs and heavily fortified positions made a conventional amphibious assault extremely costly. Japanese defenders, numbering approximately 5,000 troops, had spent years improving the island's natural defenses with tunnels, bunkers, and artillery positions. They believed the island to be essentially impregnable. Major General Charles "Doc" Willoughby, MacArthur's intelligence chief, proposed a radical solution: a combined amphibious and airborne assault, with the 503rd Parachute Infantry Regiment dropping directly onto the island's plateau, known as topside, while amphibious forces landed at the narrow beaches below. "The Japanese will never expect us to drop paratroopers onto Corregidor," Willoughby argued. "The drop zones are tiny, surrounded by cliffs, and subject to unpredictable winds. But if we can put combat power directly on top of the island, we can unhinge their entire defensive plan." Colonel George M. Jones, commanding the 503rd, was initially skeptical. "When they first briefed me on the plan, I thought they were crazy," he later wrote. The main drop zone was the size of a postage stamp, the parade ground on topside, measuring just 150 yards by 400 yards, surrounded by cliffs, wrecked buildings, and concrete gun emplacements. The mission would require precision drops from extremely low altitude, as low as 400 feet, to ensure paratroopers landed on the tiny target rather than in the sea or on the cliffs. The C-47s would have to fly directly over Japanese anti-aircraft positions to reach the drop zone. Lieutenant John Ringler, a pilot with the 317th Troop Carrier Group, remembered the briefing. They told us we'd be flying at low altitude, below 500 feet, directly into the teeth of enemy fire, with no defensive armament. And we had to hold steady during the drop, or we'd be sending those paratroopers to their deaths. It was sobering. Despite these challenges, planning for Operation Topside proceeded through January 1945. The drop would involve 2 lifts on February 16th, with a total of 2,150 paratroopers jumping onto Corregidor. 51 C-47s were assigned to the mission. As the operation approached, Japanese commanders on Corregidor remained confident in their defenses. Their intelligence had noted increased American air activity around Manila Bay, but they interpreted it as primarily supporting the ongoing battle for Manila itself. The possibility of an airborne assault on Corregidor was considered and dismissed. Captain Akira Tsushima of the Imperial Japanese Navy, who survived the battle, later testified, "We believed the Americans would have to make an amphibious landing, which we could oppose from our elevated positions. The possibility of paratroopers was discussed but rejected as too dangerous for the Americans to attempt. The drop zones were too small, and our anti-aircraft fire would make such an attempt suicidal." This assessment aligned with broader Japanese misconceptions about American capabilities and risk tolerance. Throughout the Pacific Campaign, Japanese commanders consistently underestimated the tactical flexibility that aircraft like the C-47 gave to American forces. As dawn broke on February 16, 1945, the first wave of 24 C-47s approached Corregidor from the west, flying low over the South China Sea. Inside each aircraft, paratroopers from the 503rd Regiment made final equipment checks. Many had combat jumped before, at Nadzab or Noamfur, but none had faced a drop zone as challenging as Corregidor's tiny plateau. From his observation post on topside, Lieutenant Colonel Seiichi Ota watched in disbelief as the formation of transports approached and paratroopers began jumping. His dismissive attitude toward the lumbering C-47s transformed instantly into alarm as he realized what was happening. The moment of revelation had arrived. What Japanese commanders had dismissed as ungainly, vulnerable transport planes were delivering combat power directly onto their supposedly impregnable fortress. The defensive calculations of the entire Pacific War were being rewritten in the sky above Corregidor. The first wave of paratroopers descended onto Corregidor's topside plateau amid increasing Japanese anti-aircraft fire. C-47 pilots held their aircraft steady despite the danger, ensuring their human cargo had the best possible chance of landing in the tiny drop zone rather than plummeting into the sea or onto the jagged cliffs below. "The noise was deafening," recalled Sergeant James Baldwin of the 503rd. "Japanese machine guns and our own aircraft engines, the snap of opening parachutes, men shouting commands. And through it all, our pilots just kept coming, wave after wave, right through the worst of the fire." The drop was not without cost. Strong winds pushed some paratroopers off course. Others landed on rocky terrain, suffering injuries on impact. Several drifted into Japanese defensive positions and were killed before they could free themselves from their parachutes. But the majority landed successfully on topside, quickly assembling into fighting units and securing the drop zone for the second lift. Lieutenant Colonel George Jones, commanding the 503rd, landed with the first wave. "The moment my boots hit the ground, I knew we had achieved complete tactical surprise," he later wrote. The Japanese were firing in all directions, clearly unprepared for an attack from above. They had fortified the beaches and the roads leading up from the water, but topside itself was relatively exposed. 3 hours later, as the initial drop zone was secured, a second formation of C-47s appeared over Corregidor. 27 aircraft delivered the remainder of the 503rd, along with heavy weapons and additional supplies. By mid-afternoon, more than 2,000 American paratroopers were on Corregidor, controlling the high ground and beginning to push Japanese defenders back into their tunnel systems. Simultaneous with the airborne assault, amphibious forces of the 345th Regimental Combat Team landed on the island's narrow beaches. With Japanese defensive fire drawn to the paratroopers above, the beach landings met less resistance than expected. For Lieutenant Colonel Ota and the other Japanese commanders on Corregidor, the operation represented a stunning reversal of fortune. Their carefully prepared defenses, oriented toward repelling a conventional amphibious assault, had been rendered largely ineffective by the appearance of paratroopers on the island's plateau. The vertical envelopment, made possible by the C-47 Skytrains, had changed the nature of the battle entirely. "We had no effective defense against this type of attack," a captured Japanese officer later confessed during interrogation. "Our anti-aircraft guns were too few, and the American transports came in so low and fast we had little time to target them. Once their soldiers were on the ground behind our main defensive positions, the battle was already lost." The fighting for Corregidor would continue for another 2 weeks, as Japanese forces retreated into the island's extensive tunnel networks. Many chose suicide over surrender. By March 1st, American forces declared the island secured. Of the approximately 5,000 Japanese defenders, only 20 surrendered. The remainder died in the battle or by their own hand. The American victory at Corregidor demonstrated the revolutionary impact of airborne operations enabled by the C-47. What would have been an extraordinarily costly amphibious assault against heavily fortified positions became a more balanced operation, with the airborne element neutralizing many of the defenders' advantages. General Douglas MacArthur, who had departed Corregidor in 1942 with his famous promise to return, visited the island on March 2nd. Standing on topside, where American paratroopers had descended from the sky, he reflected, "I see that the old order has changed, yielding place to new." Indeed, the new order that MacArthur observed was evident throughout the Pacific theater. The C-47 had transformed military operations in ways that pre-war planners could scarcely have imagined. The aircraft's impact extended far beyond dramatic combat jumps. Throughout the island-hopping campaign, C-47s established an unprecedented logistical network that allowed American forces to operate effectively across vast distances. While Japanese supply lines depended on vulnerable shipping, the Americans could move critical personnel, equipment, and supplies by air, bypassing enemy naval forces entirely. Major General William Marquardt, who served as MacArthur's anti-aircraft artillery commander, observed, "The Japanese had designed their defensive perimeter around the assumption that we would be constrained by traditional logistics. The C-47 rendered that assumption obsolete. We could establish airfields on captured islands, and within days be flying in everything from artillery shells to medical supplies. They had no answer to this capability." This logistical advantage became particularly evident during the Philippines campaign. As American forces advanced through the archipelago, they established forward airfields from which C-47s operated continuously, moving supplies, evacuating wounded, and repositioning troops as needed. Captain Richard Carmichael, a C-47 pilot with the 317th Troop Carrier Group, recalled the pace of operations. "We barely shut down the engines between flights. Land, unload cargo, load wounded, take off again, day after day, sometimes flying 4 or 5 missions in 24 hours. There was nothing glamorous about it, but we knew we were the lifeline for the troops on the ground. See, the scale of this aerial supply effort was staggering. During the final months of the Philippines campaign, C-47s delivered an average of 1,000 tons of supplies daily to forward airfields. They evacuated more than 40,000 wounded personnel to rear area hospitals, and they transported entire infantry units between islands, allowing commanders to rapidly reinforce successful operations or address emerging threats. Japanese forces, lacking a comparable air transport capability, found themselves increasingly immobile and isolated. Their garrisons, once expected to hold out until naval or ground reinforcements could arrive, now faced the reality that such relief might never come. American control of the air, coupled with the logistical reach of the C-47, had fundamentally altered the strategic balance. Colonel Matome Ugaki, Chief of Staff to Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, wrote in his diary in February 1945, "The Americans move with a freedom we cannot match. When we establish a defensive position, they simply go around it or over it. Their air transport capability has made our island defenses ineffective. We are fighting an enemy that appears wherever we are weakest." This mobility advantage extended to specialized operations as well. Throughout the Philippines, C-47s supported guerrilla forces operating behind Japanese lines. They delivered weapons, ammunition, and communications equipment to Filipino resistance fighters, helping to tie down Japanese troops that might otherwise have opposed the main American advance. On February 23, 1945, just days after the Corregidor operation, C-47s supported another dramatic airborne mission. At the Los Baños internment camp south of Manila, more than 2,000 civilian prisoners, American, British, and other Allied nationals, were being held in increasingly desperate conditions. Intelligence reports indicated that the Japanese guards had orders to execute all prisoners if American forces approached. In response, a combined operation was planned. Paratroopers from the 11th Airborne Division would drop from 9 C-47s near the camp, while amphibious forces crossed Laguna de Bay and Filipino guerrillas neutralized Japanese positions around the perimeter. The operation was timed to coincide with the Guards' morning exercise period, when they would be away from their posts. The raid was executed with precision. All 9 C-47s arrived on time, dropping their paratroopers accurately despite challenging conditions. The Japanese guards, caught completely by surprise, offered minimal resistance. Within hours, all 2,147 internees were evacuated to safety. Major Henry Burgess, who planned the air portion of the Los Baños raid, later emphasized the C-47's critical role. "Without those aircraft, we simply couldn't have executed the mission. They gave us the ability to place combat power exactly where and when we needed it, completely surprising the Japanese. There was no other way to reach Los Baños quickly enough to prevent the massacre of those prisoners." As the Pacific War entered its final phase in 1945, the cumulative impact of the C-47 on Japanese strategic planning became clear. Their entire defensive concept, based on forcing the Americans into costly frontal assaults against prepared positions, had been undermined by the mobility and flexibility that the transport plane provided. The statistics tell the story of American dominance in air transport. By mid-1945, more than 10,000 C-47s had been produced by American factories. The Douglas plant in Oklahoma City alone built 5,354 Skytrains between March 1943 and August 1945, outproducing Japan's entire aircraft industry. This production miracle reflected broader industrial disparities that increasingly determined the war's outcome. While Japanese aircraft factories struggled with material shortages and bombing damage, American plants operated around the clock, turning out not just combat aircraft, but the transports needed to maximize their effectiveness. A captured Japanese intelligence assessment from March 1945 acknowledged this reality. American industrial capacity allows them to produce specialized aircraft for every military function. Their transport fleet alone outnumbers our entire Air Force. We cannot match this production rate, nor can we develop effective countermeasures against their mobility advantages. The C-47's legacy extended beyond the Pacific War. The aircraft continued serving with distinction in Korea and even Vietnam. Its basic design influenced military air transport for decades, with its lessons incorporated into successors like the C-130 Hercules. The concept of vertical envelopment, inserting combat forces behind enemy lines by air, became a fundamental element of American military doctrine. Perhaps most significantly, the C-47 demonstrated that logistics and mobility, rather than raw firepower, often determine strategic outcomes. Major General William Tunner, who commanded air transport operations in the China-Burma-India theater, observed, "The weapon that ultimately defeated Japan was not the atomic bomb or the aircraft carrier. It was the American ability to move men and materiel wherever they were needed, whenever they were needed." The C-47 was the physical embodiment of that ability. For the Japanese defenders who watched in disbelief as American paratroopers descended on Corregidor in February 1945, this reality came too late. What they had dismissed as a lumbering, vulnerable transport plane had become the instrument of their defeat, delivering combat power precisely where their defenses were weakest, overturning all conventional calculations of military advantage. Lieutenant Colonel Seiichi Ota, who survived the battle and spent several years as a prisoner of war, reflected on this transformation in his post-war memoirs. "We laughed at their ungainly transport planes, never imagining they would become our nemesis. While we built better fighters and trained elite pilots, the Americans built an air transportation system that made conventional defenses obsolete. They didn't just outfight us, they outthought and outmaneuvered us." The sight of those transports approaching Corregidor, once objects of our derision, remains the moment I understood that Japan had lost the war. The C-47 Skytrain, unassuming, utilitarian, often overshadowed by more glamorous combat aircraft, had indeed helped change the face of warfare. From the jungles of New Guinea to the fortress of Corregidor, it had enabled a new kind of three-dimensional battlefield, where geography and prepared defenses no longer dictated the terms of engagement. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, reflecting on the technologies that had proven most decisive in World War II, famously listed four: the bazooka, the jeep, the atomic bomb, and the C-47. That a transport aircraft would rank alongside history's most destructive weapon in this assessment speaks volumes about its true impact. For the paratroopers who jumped from its doors, the pilots who flew it through enemy fire, and the countless soldiers whose lives depended on the supplies it delivered, the C-47 was more than just an aircraft. It represented American ingenuity, industrial might, and strategic vision, qualities that transformed a utilitarian transport plane into one of history's most influential weapons of war. The last Japanese troops on Corregidor, surrounded and without hope of reinforcement or evacuation, fought to the death or committed suicide rather than surrender. As American forces secured the island, C-47s continued their work, bringing in occupation forces and evacuating the wounded. The Gooney Birds, that Japanese defenders had once mocked, now circled overhead like harbingers of their defeat, symbols of a revolution in warfare that had made their sacrifice futile. Today, surviving C-47s are treasured museum pieces and airshow performers, their distinctive drone stirring memories in the dwindling number of veterans who flew or jumped from them. But beyond nostalgia, they represent a pivotal moment in military history, when the humble transport plane revealed itself as the ultimate expression of industrial and logistical superiority.